We good? Okay, so just as a really quick overview, oh, I need to unfreeze this, sorry. That might help. Okay, so chapter 1 is all about how children learn. And it's like a whole lifetime of study on like one chapter in a book, so a lot of information. So we kind of addressed the 3 different domains that Bloom's taxonomy dictates that learning happens in, and that's the psychomotor, cognitive, and affective domain. So psychomotor means learning by doing something, physically manipulating something to learn a task. Cognitive learning means non-tangible concepts, and you're learning about those, things that you cannot touch. Affective learning means learning about emotions or some kind of emotional response to something. Okay? And please try to address all 3 of these when you teach. As we learned on Monday, some of those might not lend itself very well to certain domains, right? That's why there's 3 different domains. Okay, psychomotor learning, we already went through this. Boom, 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 boom. Teacher-centered learning, we can skip through that, I think. Structure of musical learning. Okay, so structural musical learning. There are several different things that you have in your textbook that they go through in like bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point. Some of the highlights of that we're going to talk about this morning. So the first one is a conceptual approach. Any idea what conceptual means? What's the root word? Concept. What is conceptual? What do you think a conceptual approach might consist of? Teaching facts. Okay, and how do you think that those are approached? Those facts are approached? Or should be approached? What are we talking about? How children learn best. They need to make a what to what? They need to starts with a C. We talked about
Combine.
that. What?
Combine.
Okay. Continue, combine. We're skating around that word. What? Contribute. Yes. Connect. Thank you, Dylan. They need to connect what they know with. They need to connect what they know with what? A previous experience, right? So, a conceptual approach allows students to be exposed to several different forms of the same idea before a label is put on that. Okay? So, I'm going to expose you to the recorder as many different ways possible before we actually start playing it, which we did, right? And I asked you to figure out how many different sounds your recorder could make before I said, this is the sound that I want you to make. For a couple of different reasons, because it's a good management trick, because if they've already experienced that a recorder can make a super loud squeaky noise, they're not tempted to do that as often, at least in my experience. So this is where teachers focus on certain fundamental ideas. And all throughout this semester, every single week we're going to build upon our base knowledge of music, which is why we have Wednesdays kind of allotted for elements of music. So I'm going to expose you to the elements of music in as many different ways as possible, so then later on in the semester at midterm, you can put a label on those concepts and be able to talk about them. All right? So students should be able to conceptualize these different ideas using the same label. Okay? So a very base form of that is the understanding that 1 apple plus 1 apple equals 2 apples, and 1 orange plus 1 orange equals 2 orange. Therefore, 1 plus 1 must equal 2. Okay? So, or 1 car plus 1 car equals 2 cars. All right? 1 plus 1 is always going to equal 2, no matter what you're adding. Right? So that's what a conceptual approach is. It's exposing your students to a variety of different ways of thinking about something so that they can then take that and transfer that knowledge to their own experience. Thumbs up if I can move on from conceptual knowledge. Okay, some people are still writing at this time. Okay, so the next thing is a multisensory approach to learning. And this might seem like common sense, but a lot of the times it kind of gets pushed to the back into the background. So there's 3 different approaches to multisensory teaching, which is addressing visual learners, oral learners, which means oral canal, and kinesthetic learners, which means what? Kinesthetic is movement, people that learn best by physically manipulating something. How many people would say that they are a visual learner? They must watch something be done. How many people would say that they are an oral learner? They can listen to something. Okay. And how many people say that they are a kinesthetic learner? They have to learn by actually physically doing it. Your book divides this up into 3 different categories. However, I will let you know that that's kind of an antiquated thought process because we are all 3 of them all the time. We have to be. So please don't, address all 3 of these, but make sure that you're not trying to put yourself into one of those categories and exclude the other 2, all right? Because I am a musician and I use my ears a lot. So I would say if I was taking this quiz, I'm an oral learner. But I also am a kinesthetic learner and I'm also a visual learner all the time. So just keep that in mind. And I can send you some articles that kind of debunk this whole educational concept. For our purposes in our class, we're going to use these, okay? Later on in your educational career, you might decide, like me, that a lot of this stuff doesn't matter, and that you should be addressing all 3 of these at all times anyway. So. And this kind of goes along with the conceptual approach, right? Because if I'm exposing them to several different ideas, I can use these 3 different domains to address those, right? So we can talk, we can hear something, we can see something, and we can do something. And then we can conceptualize and label that concept at a later date. Okay, a multicultural approach to learning. This is something that I'm really interested in and I'm learning a lot about right now. So later on this semester, I think that you're going to, I'm going to do a whole unit on multicultural music instruction in the elementary school classroom, because a lot of the times I feel that this is kind of the go-to lesson or the go-to approach to integrate music into the elementary classroom. How easy is that, right? We're studying the music or people of China and I want to listen to the music of the Chinese people. Yes? Okay. And I'm here to tell you that that is not an acceptable form of an integrated lesson in this classroom. I'm not saying that it's not acceptable when you leave here, but I want to dive into some other subject matter, like how to really integrate music into math and reading and science are the predominant subject areas that we're going to study in this class. Okay, so multicultural approach provides students the opportunity to explore music and other subject areas from a variety of different cultures. There's a big push right now in education called multicultural education. Do you all have any idea what that means? Multicultural education. It's like a huge thing right now. What do you got? Let's talk about it. So if I was taking a multicultural educational approach, what would I be doing in my classroom? Maybe throw some ideas out.
The first thing that comes to my mind is maybe diversifying the classroom.
And how would I do that if I live in rural West Virginia, where my classroom is homogeneous and all white?
Expose your students to situations or scenarios or other types of things that show multiculturalism?
Okay, so I could expose my students to other cultures, which I encourage you to do. But that's just like the little tip of the iceberg in multicultural education, okay? What else should I really be doing if I'm truly teaching from a multicultural perspective? The first step is to expose your students to another culture. What's the next step? What do you think would be important about teaching something of another culture? Allie?
Maybe to be unbiased, like,
Okay. Yes. Go further than that. So I'm making sure that I have no personal prejudice about the culture that I'm teaching, right? It's definitely A+, yes. That's a really important thing to have. But if I'm exposing my students to that culture, I need to have an unbiased approach. What's the next step?
Maybe like how to respect other cultures.
Okay, so how to respect other cultures. And I think inherently that we're going, if I'm exposing them in my classroom, that's kind of one of the things that I'm going to do automatically, right? So as a teacher, what do I have to make sure that my students are getting?
The reality of it?
Okay, give me another word for reality.
the correct information.
Okay, correct information. And why would sometimes it wouldn't be incorrect? Let's take, if we're studying in 4th grade colonial America, which is a typical thing in Kentucky to do. So one of the things about colonial America is that they had to deal with the Native Americans, right? And we get a very skewed perspective on how that event took place. Yes? Okay. So from our mind, we came over and we were what?
Welcome.
What?
Well, we're taught like we were welcome almost.
We were welcome, and then nothing ever happened to these poor Indians until like 100 years later. Okay? Megan?
I say show like a positive and negative example. Both
Okay.
sides of it.
Yes. So what do you mean by that? So I'm allowing them to view another culture from that culture's
Perspective.
what?
Perspective.
Perspective. Okay? So true multicultural teaching is putting your students in that culture's shoes as best as you possibly can. So to do that, there has to be a few things that you address. First of all, you have to address both the positive and negative from that cultural perspective. Also, multicultural education really should address some type of social justice, okay? And we'll talk more about that later on this semester. The third thing it should happen, it should make a meaningful connection to that culture in some capacity. Okay? So a prime example, I'm going to make you watch a TED Talk later on this semester about a teacher that's in Colorado who is a big proponent of multicultural education. And one of the things that she does, she talks about is her daughter in 2nd grade at an independent charter school writing a letter from the perspective of a Native American woman that's going through the Trail of Tears. So that's like truly what I'm getting at right now. I'm not just teaching them about the Native Americans, I'm having them think from their perspective. It addresses some kind of social justice because what they did to those Native Americans was completely wrong, but it gets brushed over and aside, right? And you can still talk about that in 2nd grade, that's developmentally appropriate. And it's meaningful to the student, okay? And we'll talk a lot more about that later. There's a whole, his name's, I think, Joseph Banks, maybe I'm completely wrong. Dr. Banks, he's at the University of Washington, was the founder of multicultural education in like the 60s when the civil rights movement kind of came to fruition. And so we'll see an interview with him, and we'll see this TED Talk, and all this really cool stuff. So, anyways. Okay, so as far as this class goes, we're gonna kind of stay away from multicultural lessons unless you can do it well, and then we'll talk about that later on. So also think about like historical context as well as far as music and other things. So not just the culture of today, but historical context as well. All right. Okay, your assignment also asked you to talk about experiential learning, which is not addressed in this PowerPoint, so let's talk about that really quick. Experiential learning is what? We've talked a lot about it, we've labeled it. What else needs to happen? Somebody else other than Alyssa this morning. Alyssa had enough coffee to talk. So, experiential education. Somebody over here. Everyone's not looking at me on purpose. Megan, yeah.
Something you have to like actually physically do.
Okay, so it's something that you actually have to do or experience, hence the root word, yes? Yeah, that's great. As a teacher, how is it facilitated?
You're more of a guide.
Okay, so you're more of a guide. And here's the big thing, the big like hook for experiential learning, is that I'm making my students solve a problem to learn. Okay? And here's the beauty of good teaching, which we'll find out maybe on Friday or next Friday, is the fact that like, if you give students room to create something within the context of a lesson, they have to figure out how to create it. And if you make the parameters of creation, this sounds like a lot of words, but it's not. If you make the parameters of creation very finite, which means beginning and end, and have them solve a puzzle, there's only a few right answers. And then you as the teacher can choose which one you want to pick. And I'll expose you to that later on this semester. So experiential learning is having the students come up with their own creation during a part of the lesson, or solve a problem, or any number of things, so that they can conceptualize a concept, and then you as a teacher can put that label on it after the fact, so that they have a point of reference to refer to. So it's creating experience so they can learn better, so they can connect it to what they know. That's what it is in a nutshell.
So is that like what we did when we had to draw the letter of our first name and our partner's first name?
What would be experiential about that?
The only reason I said anything was because that day you gave us finite directions, because when you didn't, we were all confused.
Yes, okay. So that's good teaching, and I hope that you do that too. That's not quite experiential learning.
Okay.
Let's go back to last Wednesday, I think, when we did the Queen Caroline poem in here, and I had you come up with your own body percussion parts using snaps, pats, claps, and stamps. Do you remember that? And so I said, make sure that the first and the fourth line and the second and third line are the same. Remember me saying that? And then you had to come up with your own way to perform that. That's experiential learning. I set those finite parameters, meaning that you can only have 2 different body percussion parts, right? So that I could assess whether or not you understood that the rhythm of the first line and the fourth line are the same, and that the rhythm of the second and the third line are the same. And I'm really, really thankful that there was a group right here that did not do it correctly, because then I could address that. Because sometimes in this class, as adults, a lot of the time, we kind of glance over that whole correction process. So that's experiential learning in a nutshell, Alyssa. Maybe not in a nutshell, maybe in like a coconut shell or something.
That makes sense. I was just.
Okay. So during your micro teaches, experiential learning would be, if you're teaching a song, have them come up with some kind of movement for a lyric so that they can remember the lyrics of the song. Or have them contour the melody somehow so that they can remember how the melody goes. If you're teaching a rhythmic poem, that might mean having them come up with a body percussion part for the ostinato so that they fundamentally understand it. Okay? All right, so the last few slides, the last part of your book does a really good job of addressing students with special needs in a music classroom only. And this is like a whole semester-long course that we could talk about special needs in the music classroom, or just students with special needs to begin with. So, some vocabulary words to understand. Oh, read the bottom part right here, special needs students. Is that politically correct at this moment in time? Why is it not?
Because you're not saying your child first.
Okay, it's not person first language, right, Alex? So if I needed to switch that, which I did this on purpose, if I needed to switch that, what would happen? I would have to do what? Students with special needs, right? So make sure that if you're addressing or talking about students with special needs, that you're using person-first language at all times, including in your assignments. It's just something to get used to. So it's not the blind student, it is the student with a visual impairment. Because most likely the visual impairment is a very small part of who she is or her or he is as a person. Yeah? Okay. So let's go through these vocabulary words, or actually they're not vocabulary terms, they're more like acronyms. So what is an IEP?
Individualized education.
Individualized education plan. And why are IEPs very important? Has anybody ever seen an IEP? No one's seen an IEP. You've seen an IEP? Alex, can you tell us a little bit about an IEP?
Just sets like goals for a specific, like allotted time. I don't know how to explain that.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so it sets goals for a student with special needs, right? So an IEP is a legal binding document. A legal binding document that is facilitated by the educational system, and it is a meeting of the school psychologist, the teacher, the special ed coordinator or a special ed teacher, and maybe an administrator, and the parent. And what they do is they sit down, and first of all, the student has to go through several different types of assessments before they can have an IEP, okay? So an IEP meeting is when they sit down and they set forth goals for their student during the school year, okay? This is really important for you as teachers because you are legally bound to address the accommodations and modifications that are listed in the IEP, okay? So keep in mind that goals are goals. They can be reached and surpassed, or they could be worked on and progressed throughout the year. That's not a problem. You're not legally bound to have your students reach those goals. I hope that you try to, but you're not legally bound to, all right? So, but you are legally bound to implement the accommodations and modifications for that student. So let's talk about accommodation and modification. There's a huge difference between the two. What are they? Rachel.
Well, I know that modification, like modifying something is to like change the actual like concept for the student to understand.
Okay, good. Yes, and that's the huge divide there. So in accommodation, you are accommodating that student, but you're not changing the content. Okay? So if someone has a visual impairment, they might have preferential seating in your classroom at the front of the room. If they have a hearing impairment, you might have an interpreter that's in the classroom with you. All right? But you're not changing the content whatsoever. If they need more time on a test, if they're diagnosed ADHD and they need more time on a test, you're accommodating that time. But you're not changing what's on the test. Modifying or addressing modifications in your classroom is that you're modifying your content to meet the needs and goals of the IEP. Okay? So those are two separate things, and a lot of times students and even teachers use these terms interchangeably, and they're not interchangeable. Modification means I'm literally changing the content. Accommodation, I'm just allowing students, facilitating better student use of content, if that makes sense. I'm accommodating the student. I hate using the word in the definition, but. Okay, thumbs up for an IEP. And you'll go over this in your, I hope, later on in your educational career here at UK. Do you all have to take a course specifically addressing students with special needs?
I'm taking one right now.
And how is it?
It's good. It's EDS 375. I'm not sure if it's required or not.
Okay,
It is.
it is, that's good, okay.
And then there's an exceptional learners class too, EDP 303.
Okay. Interesting. Cool. So, Rael, tell us about LRE. Do you know what that is?
It's actually interesting. I was looking at these and I forgot damn it.
Okay. let's go with Alex.
Least restrictive environment.
Least restrictive environment. What is that? And these are not in your book, these are just things that I really think that you need to know as a teacher. Especially next semester when you're probably going out to do practicums at the beginning of the semester and some of this stuff might not be addressed. So least restrictive environment, what is that? Haley?
Keeping a student in an environment that's still challenging for them.
Okay. So their needs are here. Megan.
Put them in a classroom that they can like excel the most at.
Okay. So least restrictive environment is when I place a child in an educational setting that allows them the freedom to learn without disrupting other students.
Yeah.
Okay? And that's one of the big crux, issues with LRE. All right? So if I have a student that is on the autism spectrum and his least restrictive environment is a full inclusion classroom, that's fantastic, right? But if I have a severe profound student, the least restrictive environment typically will not be in a regular classroom because they are working on occupational goals, such as how to hold a fork or a pencil, okay? So their least restrictive environment would be in a separate classroom. So, or if I'm working with a student whose least restrictive environment is in a regular classroom except for a specific subject like reading or math, they might go to another classroom for that. Okay? So, FAPE, FAPE, what is it? And this is really important for students with special needs.
Free, appropriate public education.
Yeah, free, appropriate public education. And this is an act that ensures that students with special needs are able to acquire an education for free, just like any, not normal student, but any other student that you would have come in contact with. You know what else this does? This provides services for students for free. Okay? So students with special needs receive these services for free because of this act. Other thing that's a lot unknown is that if you attend private school, how many people went to a private Catholic school in here? Maybe? Okay, so Katie, you attended private school, let's say Lexington Catholic. All right? If they did not offer a service at the Lexington Catholic, you could get that for free at a public school. You know what I'm saying? So if you needed speech pathology and they didn't offer that service at Lexington, you could go and receive that through the state for free. So just keep that in mind as well. Okay? So IDEA. IDEA. It's Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And this is before FAPE, I think. I'm not sure. They all happened in the 70s, I believe. And this is a document that instituted like the IEP and all the accommodations and modifications that you could make in a classroom and all of that other wonderful stuff. I just want to make sure that you are exposed to these terms before you go out into the world and teach. Okay, music for special learners. Here's the deal. Music is a subject that I feel very passionate about because every person in the entire world is a musician. Okay? Let me say that again. Every person in the entire world is a musician. There are three components to a musician, and let's talk about those really quick. You don't have to write them down. It's the performer, the listener, and the interaction between the two. Okay? So even if you don't think that you are musically gifted, quote unquote, which a lot of you have written in your student information survey, like, oh, I'm not a musician. Well, you can train yourself to be a very good musical listener. And that's a huge talent in and of itself. And we'll address that later on the semester. By the time you leave here, you will have the ability to talk about music, maybe not perform it at a professional level, right? But talk about it with a musician or a music specialist in your school. That's my goal. So, whenever I was teaching elementary school for several years, music always was a full inclusion classroom. So, that being said, I had students of all different ability levels in my class. So, to try and differentiate instruction for those students as a music teacher was rather difficult. However, music is one of the only subject areas that's equally accessible by everyone on some level. All right? So Rael over here might not be the star diva from the play. However, she can keep a steady beat, right? And she can accompany a singer. And she can have just as satisfying a musical experience for her as somebody over here that's singing a solo. Also, music's one of the only subjects that activates multiple parts of your brain at the same time. And we'll talk about that later on too. So, how will having a special learner affect the rest of the class? Have you ever thought about that? How will having somebody that has, and I have a prime example, his name was Jason. When I was teaching in the Bronx, he was in they compartmentalized their classes. Do you know what that means? So they took all the test scores and they put all the super high test scores in one class and all the super low test scores in one class and mixed up the middle for the rest of the classes. Okay, best way to do things, right? No. And so Jason was actually in the gifted class is what they called it, because students with Asperger's are typically very intelligent and are able to do several different processes much faster than we can as people without Asperger's, okay? So they also have sensory integration issues typically, and social integration issues. Okay, so we're gonna get there. So Jason would come to my music class, and he was able to do everything else that the students were, but he did not want to do it. He wanted to act like a bird and play with my musical instruments. Okay, so, and what do you think I did? What do you think I did? There's a class of 32 students, which is a typical class size in New York. I have one student that is chirping like a bird very loudly, and the rest of them have been trained not to react to this, which is really fantastic of the teacher to do, you know. So if you talk to your students about students with special needs, they'll be trained to react the way you want them to. You have to teach them behavior. And so this teacher was very good about teaching behavior to her students. So what do you think I did as the teacher? I only saw them once a week, so it wasn't like I had a close relationship with this student with special needs. He wanted to go chirp like a bird or play my musical instruments and make noise. What should I let him do?
Did you let him chirp like a bird?
Sometimes. Typically not. I let him play with my musical instruments. Because that, for him, was his most satisfying musical experience in my classroom. Now, when it came to doing other things, he would jump in if we were doing something that he was interested in. But I understood that for him, a lot of things that we were doing in class, like rhythmic poems, playing these barred instruments, was not as intellectually stimulating for him as it could have been. So for him to go and play my metallophone and make up melodies on his own, I said, that's fine, go compose some stuff. And we even took some of the stuff that he composed and worked it into our performance. So for him, that over there was his least restrictive environment, and I was okay with that. Plus it was only 45 minutes of my week, and that is a drop in the bucket, and that's fantastic if that's what he wants to do. Yes, ma'am.
So what do you do when another child is like, why does he get to do that?
That's a really good question. And you have to teach the behavior that you want from your students. All right? And typically I would say, well, if you would like to go compose something with these parameters like Jason's doing, go for it. But most of the time, if we're doing a group activity and like we're dancing and singing and playing a game or something, they're gonna wanna join us. So, and the beauty about music is that, have you heard of reinforcement? what do they call it? Like, you get stickers for doing things. What is it?
Positive reinforcement?
Positive reinforcement, yes, but it's called something. It's called a token economy. But, what is that called? Why can't I think of that? Do you know what I'm talking about? Like, Dylan did a really good job today, he gets a sticker. So, and I'll think of the name later. The beauty about that is that in the music classroom, the music's the reward. It's a reward system, there we go. So, moment for a second in my own brain. So a reward system works in a music classroom if you use the music as a reward. So typically I would say, well, you can go do that, or you can join us in playing this game and making this music with us. And they would say, oh, okay. And then I would do a lot of instruction about how to react to something like that. So,
Okay. I like work at an after school program
uh-huh,
and I have like 12 kids. And one of my kids has fetal alcohol syndrome.
okay.
She does not focus or want to do anything that we do. The only thing she'll do is like play on the computer.
Right.
If like one kid sees her on the computer, all of them want to do it. So I just don't even know, like, I don't even know what to say.
Right.
But yeah, it's just really difficult.
You have to teach them the behavior that you want,
Yeah.
which is really hard to do in an after-school
Like,
program.
I don't know whether to explain to them like that, like why I'm doing it, or I don't know.
Well, what would you do if you were an actual teacher?
I mean, I would probably, like, if I was an actual teacher, I'd probably, like, teach my kids from the beginning about special needs and
Okay.
different disabilities. But it's not.
How
like
old
I-
is the student?
They're first graders.
Okay. So would you teach about different disabilities in first grade?
Probably not.
You can.
But do you think that they would, like, get the concept?
If it's done the right way, yes. But you're not going to have the time to implement that in an after-school program. Does
Right.
that make sense?
Right, yeah.
So that might be something that might be a good idea to have, like a newsletter go home explaining to parents what's happening, and then talk to your child about this outside of this
Yeah.
after-school program.
Okay.
And then, that way, you can address it that way without excluding anybody else.
Right, okay.
So, okay.
Mhm.
Any other suggestions or ideas?
When we become actual teachers and there is a student with special needs in our classroom,
Uh-huh.
if we were to send a newsletter home, it wouldn't be
It wouldn't be about, yeah.
Right, but would we address maybe the special need that student has, as well as others, that way?
I would probably, here's what I would do personally as a teacher, is at the beginning of the year, I always make sure I want to connect with my parents as much as possible. So I invite them into my classroom and I stay after school so that we can, and I actually call and schedule meetings at the very beginning of the year. And I will say, this is what we're going to do in my classroom, here are the rules in my classroom, please sign this contract saying that you understand the rules and consequences in my classroom, because I feel that's very important, because that puts a locus of control on you, and then it makes them like, oh, you've signed this contract, your student's not obeying the rules, this is why they have detention today after school. Okay? So, and in the context of that meeting, I would say we have a very diverse classroom. Sometimes some of my students are allowed to do other things that other students are not, because that is how I modify and accommodate in my class instruction in my class. So please be aware that I'm not excluding your child whatsoever, I'm accommodating for another. And I would just leave it very general like that. That's a really good question. So it's been a long time since I've had to do that. So, any other suggestions or questions about that? No? Okay, so we're going to completely change gears here, and we're going to learn about musical notation. So for the time being, just put your stuff away. Megan, will you push stop for a second? Will you make sure this isn't the